So if you've got dampness at the base of your wall or dampness anywhere, and you're worried that you've got rising damp, then you've come to the right place. I'm Simon, I'm a surveyor at Damp Surveys, and last month we came across 20 properties with different types of dampness. A majority of people thought there was one type of dampness that turned out to be another type of dampness, and I'll go through exactly why. Now, the topic and the theme of this month will be change. Quite often, all you need to know is what has changed in the property in order to diagnose the cause of the dampness. It's not necessarily the only thing that you need to know, but it really helps diagnose the damp, recommend the treatment and therefore the long-term solution without having to resort to damp-proofing treatment. So the change can be double glazing, it can be a broken vent, it can be a new property, new neighbours, work going on next door, retirement. It can be a whole number of issues that cause dampness. And each one of those came up during the days. In addition, we're going to look at 3 properties subject to a home buyer survey. The first one was where it was a recent purchase. The damp proofer recommended damp proofing treatment. It turned out that actually they had a leak and nothing to do with rising damp. Second one where the buyer, we represented the seller of the property. The buyer had a surveyor who said that there was a rising damp problem. They recommended a damp proofer get a quote. The damp proofer obviously quoted something like 13,000 plus VAT. And it turned out to be a leak and some hygroscopic salts. And in addition, and I wasn't part of the survey, but my nephew asked me about a property he was buying where the surveyor said there was dampness at the base of the wall. The property had been vacant for about 6 months, so it wasn't surprising. And he asked me for a recommendation, and I made a recommendation that might surprise you, and I'll detail it at the end and why. So we're going to go through each one of the properties in order. In addition, we're going to have a look at the data loggers, and then we'll look at the 3 purchases in more detail. So property A is a ground floor Victorian conversion. So the change has been converting to a flat, which increases the amount of vapour that's been generated on the ground floor, which is going to have poorer insulation or at least greater heat loss than the upstairs. We see it's colourless. It's around the light sockets where you get the heat loss. So light sockets themselves are changes from the original design, but also see all the bottles there in the corner. That's going to cause heat loss and increase the amount of low temperature in an area of high vapour. And there was poor ventilation in this property. You'll see it in other properties. So the next one is this quite large, it's over 2 floors. It's a converted Victorian bakery, I believe. And we've got water, moisture, dampness around where the piping was, and it's all across the property. Something quite interesting is that they keep it relatively warm, but there's very poor ventilation. Specifically, the kitchen extractor fan isn't working properly, if at all, and the bathroom extractor fans weren't working properly. And it's all around the cold zones. And the cold pipe brings in water at about 8 degrees centigrade in winter, can be less than that. And that causes an area of heat loss. So we're going to look at all the data loggers later at the end. So the next property was a rental property. The owner was worried that there was penetrating damp from the chimney, but there was no brown staining. And you've got to remember with chimney breast, so chimneys are made from, a normal brick wall is 2 skins of brick. A chimney is essentially 2 skins with a void in the middle. And when it's not in use, which it isn't, and that's the change, you'll tend to get heat loss in the center of the chimney, increasing the risk of condensation, which is what was happening here. Obviously the issue is the vapor, but it's been made worse by the chimney breast, and some insulation will go a long way to solving that problem. So the next property D is a property I've been to before. And in fact, the issue, the damp wall is now basically dry because they've followed my recommendations. It does take a bit of time to dry out, and there's possibly a little bit of extra heat loss in the corner there. Now, property E, very interesting in that actually saw condensation on the wall at the time of the survey. It's very unusual to see it. We know that it's there most of the time, but it tends to happen in the middle of the night when we're not around. So to actually see it is really useful. Now, the interesting thing is that the relative humidity is 58, which may make think, well, 58 is good. But if you look at the dew point was 13, and yet the cold wall was 12 degrees centigrade, 12.5 degrees centigrade. So it was below the dew point, so you're going to get condensation in that cold external corner there, with poor airflow. So the next property F is, so here there's a couple that are retired, and there isn't very good ventilation in the kitchen, but what's happening is that the kitchen's open onto an old, what would have been an outside building or pantry. It's poorly insulated, there's no heat there, and you're getting the vapor coming through from the kitchen and it's spilling into this area and causing heat loss. There's also mold taking place in the cupboard behind this kitchen because there used to be a doorway the other side, and it's very cold, there's no insulation there. So the solution is to deal with the vapor, excess vapor, but also to help with the insulation, including in the outbuilding. Next property is 1950s with the cavity wall. The interesting thing here now is that there was an extension, and we'll see on the other side of the extension, but in the middle of these glass areas there's heat loss and condensation. And we'll look at the data loggers in more detail for this particular property, because it's interesting in that the wall was actually acting as a dehumidifier and dampness. So you can see there, that's a cavity wall, and in the middle there's cavity wall insulation that's damp. But it isn't damp because it's penetrating from the outside. It's damp because that bit of wall on the left hand side is actually a single skin of bricks, and you can see the cavity in the middle. Somebody has extended, done something with the windows, changed something, and got a single brick wall. And you've got to remember that a single brick wall will have half the insulation of a double brick wall, so you're going to get a huge amount of heat loss, and it's wetting the cavity. But that's not really where the issue is taking place. The other thing is that there's rot, and I'm pretty sure it's it looked like dry rot. In fact, we found wood weevil, which is an indication that it's cellar rot rather than dry rot. It doesn't really matter because it's not structural. The piece of timber can be removed and replaced, but there's nothing structural. It's not affecting the joists in the subfloor. So the recommendation is put some insulation. Now, an interesting thing on this one is where we got the brown staining. That's an indication of water passing through the roof in this case. And the roof has been repaired. I think it was about 6 months ago, and that wall is starting to dry now, which is really good. So the next property is a rental property. There was some mold in the bay, in the corner of the front bay there. Slightly brown tinge, difficult to tell with mold, but on the outside you could see there was green, there was moss, indicating water is overflowing, and it happened to be during a rainstorm, and we could see the water dripping over. There's another area where they have had water, or there is some ongoing water issues there that needs to be dealt with as well. But the interesting thing is to see the mold in one corner compared to another in the same bay, and it's not an issue there. But there is mold elsewhere in the property, and that mold is coming from heat loss. So mold grows where relative humidity goes above 85% for long periods of time. It's a product of both the amount of vapor in air, so dew point, but also the heat, the temperature. And in this case, there was a insulation missing from sections. And in fact, you could see it in the loft, and it's very simple to just push the insulation back in, and that solved, or at least reduced, the risk of mold there. But vapour was an issue throughout the property, and we're getting it downstairs in the bay. It's very common to get mold condensation in bays. So property J was an end of terrace Victorian property, possibly an infill or an addition. Recently purchased. There was mold discovered when they removed the cupboarding from the corner there. The lady, the owner, had sprayed the wall with anti-mold spray, so it got rid of most of the visible signs of mold, but you can see there's a lot of heat loss there. These are relative values, so they put in a new ventilation, and it's gone a long way to solve the problem. So the next property, it's an outbuilding that's been added to the kitchen. We could see condensation on the window panes at the time of the survey. So these outbuildings tend to be made from single brick, or they're not very well insulated, and they get lots of heat loss. So the fact that it was open up to the elements meant that it was at risk of condensation. And in fact, we can see that the dew point, the temperature of the floor, was below the dew point. The other thing is, in solid floors, you will tend to get water being absorbed up the wall unless the plaster is properly dealt with. In addition, we had a leak either started during the survey. Fortunately, it wasn't myself, but it either started the survey or was already there. And going into the subfloor void, I couldn't measure the humidity in the subfloor void because I couldn't get access to it. But that's something to deal with, and we'll look at that in another property later on. But importantly here, the vent isn't going out from the kitchen. You're getting drying clothes. There's the washing machine and dryer, I believe, there. So you've got this area of excess vapor, and that's the root cause of the dampness in that property. So property K, Victorian Terrace property. This is another lower ground floor property. It had been tanked, so tanked to stop water getting in. It's on a hill, so you wouldn't get groundwater, but you can get penetrating damp from underneath. But what was happening here, so we got dampness in the toilet on the party wall, and there's the pipe that's coming through. And notice when you're pouring cold water, it's coming in at 8 and a bit, 9 degrees centigrade, and that's passing along the pipe. So it's 12 degrees centigrade, 11.7. But in fact, the dew point at the time of the survey was 13.6. So there's condensation forming on that cold water pipe whenever the cold water is being used. So property I, Victorian Terrace property. So this is a recent purchase. The home buyer surveyor recommended having a damp proofer, and the damp proofer recommended £4,000 worth of damp proofing treatment, completely ignoring the fact that it's been damp proofed in the past. And we discovered highest relative humidity in the subfloor void. What can happen is condensation can form above the damp proof course and force water to rise up the wall. So that needs to be dealt with. You'll see that the most likely cause of dampness in the subfloor is from a heating system leak. So these are pictures from another property. You can see the beads of condensation forming above the dampproof course. Now the radiator, the heating system, was showing 0.4 bar, which suggests that it's that you've got a leak on the heating system, and that obviously needs to be solved. I tested, I couldn't find any leaks around the property on the radiators, but so the radiator pipes going into the subfloor, and I suspect what's happening is that you're getting a leak there. Now, it is possible that it's an innocent problem, and you definitely had a condensation issue, and you had too much vapor and insufficient ventilation. So it's possible that you're getting condensation forming on a pipe dripping into the subfloor void. And if you deal with the condensation and you measure the subfloor relative humidity, that should solve that problem if it isn't a heating system. So next property, you're getting mold in a cupboard. It's a kitchen at the back, so it's poorly insulated. There's no obvious issues on the outside. Mold grows to relative humidity goes above 85%, and even though the dew point was 10 degrees centigrade, and I think the temperature was 14, but you're within that mold risk zone, probably 75% relative humidity, but at night it could be much higher. So the next property, Victorian, I believe, with an unusual curved bay, but it may be Edwardian. So there's dampness at the back of the property. What had happened was there was a rental flat on the ground floor, and a leak was found, and they had tanked this. Well, tanking actually stops the wall from breathing, and you notice that with the damp meter that it's 100% above the tanking and to the side, but the tanking material is actually stopping it. So in this case, what was happening is it had been converted from 2 flats into a single house. And during that time, there's a long time when the property was empty, open to the elements and cold. So that party wall was actually essentially becoming the external wall, and condensation is forming on that wall. And that in this case, it's the neighbours that had changed their property rather than themselves. This was part of an extension. There was no ventilation from the kitchen, and no extractor fan, and so there are lots of other issues to deal with. But just understanding that the neighbours' change was a key issue. Now here's another property. There's a lower ground floor, and this is a chimney breast that had been opened up, and there's rot. So when there's rot, we know that that's not primarily caused by hygroscopic salts. We'll talk about hygroscopic salts later. When there's rot, it's because there's water there. And this, I believe, is dry rot. It was very dry at the time. It's not structural, so it's not of significance, and it just needs to be removed and replaced. It's skirting board. You can see the cuboidal cracking, which is a sign of dry rot. On the other side of the property, there's a fireplace, and I think part of the change here was changes to the circumstances of the neighbour. So the next property is an infill. It's 1950s cavity wall, and there's dampness behind the dishwasher or washing machine, and that's because what's happening is it's the heat loss and vapour gets in. I don't think this has had cavity wall insulation. I've had a look at it a few times to see if I can spot the telltale signs of cavity wall insulation. You normally get the little holes, but I don't see it. There is a crack there, but it's a vertical crack. So I don't think that is letting water in. I think it's just insufficient ventilation. In fact, the kitchen extractor fan didn't duct out, and drying clothes internally and so on and so forth leads to those problems. Have a look at the data loggers. So the next property is 1920s mid-war. We're getting mold ironically around the external passive vent. I'm not a believer in those passive vents, and this is a good example of why. In this case, the door of the cupboard is closed, and so you're going to get no airflow and a build-up of humidity. Whenever you open the cupboard, you get the vapour coming in, you close it off, it gets closed, and it doesn't get the heat, so it gets all the heat loss. And in this case, you're getting a rim of mold and condensation around the tops, and that's because you're getting all that heat loss. You can see with the thermal imaging camera where blue is colder than green, yellow, red. And in this case, the temperature was below the dew point, so you're always going to get condensation. And here we didn't have enough ventilation. The kitchen wasn't properly ventilated out, drying clothes internally, high occupancy, and so on. Next property is interesting, or they're all interesting, but this one is interesting because it's hygroscopic salts. This is on a party wall, and there's nothing particularly happening on the other side of the party wall. I had a look at it, I measured it. There's no high humidity in the subfloor void, so 72% is normal. And what happens with hygroscopic salts? So these are salts primarily that come from chimney breasts, from the burning of coal. And you can see all that soot there. And when it's opened up or it's replastered or anything changed, it can release those salts. And these hygroscopic salts cause what's called deliquescence, which is a type of condensation, but at normal levels of relative humidity. So with calcium nitrates at between 50 and 60% relative humidity, it starts to condense, and anything above that, you get a lot of dampness. So you can see it in the summertime as well as in the winter. And here you'll see it's in different parts of the wall. It's not showing up so much on the neighbour side. So we go into this is a Victorian flat end of terrace, and even as we came in through the door, we noticed that there was condensation dribbling off the window. There's mold in different patches, so particularly behind the door. And the interesting thing here is that the base of the wall in certain parts of the property were dry, which we wouldn't have expected. And the reason why is it has an interesting type of heating system. It has a skirting board heating system. So where at the start of the run, the wall was nice and dry, by the end of the run, when there was getting less heat out of the skirting board, there was condensation on the base of the wall, and a lot more mold around that area. So the mold was caused by lack of ventilation. There was no bathroom ventilation, no kitchen ventilation, relatively high occupancy, and working from home. So a lot of vapor generated, and no way of removing it. The key concern was mold. Simple thing to do is spray anti-mold spray like HG anti-mold spray, and increase ventilation. Maybe use the German method, keeping the window open for 10 minutes in the morning, and running a dehumidifier, particularly when drying clothes internally, and use data loggers to measure the internal vapor levels to make sure that you're keeping the internal dew point below the outside temperature. See how you're getting condensation on the double glazed window and the mold. That if that's obviously immediately obvious that vapor is a key issue. So the dew point was 14.2 and 14.52, and that was above the temperature of the wall. So you're bound to get mold and condensation. Tricky in smaller properties, and we've all been there, we've all struggled. Really, data's the best thing, and if you can't get it to work with a dehumidifier, the German method of opening the windows either side and keeping them open for 10 minutes at least. So next property, really interesting, again, another interesting property. So in the front downstairs on the lower ground floor, there's a patch of black soot. This was an old chimney breast that had been removed, and you're getting hygroscopic salts. So you're getting calcium sulfate salts. These are not hygroscopic, they're calcium sulfate. They blister, they're white powder. Old name for calcium sulfate was gypsum, which is the name for plaster. In this case, it wasn't particularly cold, but I happen to know the neighbours, and I wasn't able to see it. But what I understand is there's an Aga on the other side, and it's now being rented out. And I suspect the Aga isn't being turned on for a large part of the year, and you're getting this big body of cold. Now, interesting thing in this property is that there's an artesian well underneath it, and it's about 2 meters, 6 to 8 foot below level, so it wouldn't have affected it. But it's really interesting because you don't normally find areas where you got high groundwater, but it's an artesian well that's pushing the groundwater out. In London, the groundwater is pumped out, so you're not going to get rising damp in groundwater because rising damp comes from groundwater. So the next property is a property that was for sale. I put this separately because I didn't have data loggers for it. It's ex-rental. There's no risk of groundwater in this area. And this is a quick run through the survey, but basically you've got mold at the base of the wall. So it tells me that there are no hygroscopic salts. No hygroscopic salts there. There must be excess vapor. The issue is that it's been damp proofed. Hygroscopic salts can also come from groundwater, but they're most commonly that come from from coal and or equine urine, excrement. And in the old days, you can see on the outside that the hygroscopic salts. You see that band on the outside. That's hygroscopic salts. I told the buyers about, so they had a quote from Kenwood for 13,500 plus VAT, I think. And I showed them examples of Kenwood's work. In fact, this property has already had damp proofing treatment. So if it didn't work first time, it's unlikely to work a second time. In fact, it was nothing to do with the groundwater. Normally, when a property has been damp proofed, it's not because of rising damp. In fact, damp proofing increases the risk of condensation and mold because it's a poor insulator. It doesn't buffer, absorb vapor, increases the vapor load on a property, increasing the risk of mold and condensation, which is what you're having here. These are examples of hygroscopic salts around the country. I brought to the attention of the Property Care Association why they were mistaken in thinking this was groundwater. It's obviously hygroscopic salts. And you can tell that. So in this case, there are hygroscopic salts on an internal chimney breast. Very obvious, you can see them there. The subfloor relative humidity was high, it wasn't off the scale. And I found, so it was about halfway between the internal dew point and the external dew point. So higher than it should have been, but not off the scale. And I found two reasons why it could be. So there was that gap and the partially blocked front drain. And also there's the stopcock was leaking, but not much. You couldn't see any change in the dial on the outside. So like so many rental properties, this was poorly ventilated. The bathroom extractor fan had a manual fan vent that wasn't used or wasn't working, or probably wouldn't have been used even if it was working, and no externally ducted kitchen extractor fan, and a dehumidifier that shows that they were concerned about humidity, but it's just way too small. You need a 20 litre per day dehumidifier. Now I'm going to go on to all the data loggers now. 20 properties here. Not all of these properties have data on them, but this is all the properties at the same time, and you want to be aiming for a internal dew point that's never above the outside temperature. Clearly you can see instances where all of the properties above the outside temperature, and I'll explain that and what can be done about it. But I'm just going to clear it, and I'm just going to talk about the first 4 properties on here. So they are almost all. So A, you can see, is above the average, and in fact is the highest at times. Property B is in line with the average, slightly above at times. C isn't there. D is above the average and high at other times, as you can see, and likewise E is very high. But if we go on to F, you'll see now F is interesting in that it's actually an outbuilding, so it is getting very little vapor from internally. You can see it's the lowest of all of these. It has the door open to the kitchen from time to time, but it's essentially working as an outbuilding with some degree of airflow and no heat from inside. And that's also the same for G. Well, G is interesting in that it's actually the single brick wall of a cavity wall, so it's got half the insulating property of a normal wall. It's damp, and what's happening is when there is well, you can see that the dew point is remaining relatively stable. When it's cold, it's bringing in vapor because it's acting as a dehumidifier, and likewise when it's warmer outside, it's releasing some vapor. And also you can see the external dew points higher as well. So we'll carry on looking at the different properties. So again, I is high, J is high, K is high, and L is high. M and N are relatively low, which is good. So we're actually going on to a different week now. And so this is the mean, this black line in the center. And both M and N is good, actually. N is particularly good. O is average, but above average for a large part of the time. P is high, and property Q is missing. Property R is below average and is reasonably good, getting towards the outside dew point. Property S is missing, and property T, again, we didn't have a lot of data, but the dew point is relatively high. So I'm now going to look at the dew point and discuss property G. The system for using the data loggers. It's at damp.ai/detect off the website damp.ai. You just drag and drop all your files in here, which I've already done for this property, and then compare different rooms. So now you want to compare the damp wall to the nearest source of vapor, but in this case I don't have a secondary nearest source of vapor. All the data loggers were held in the damp room, but it did give me some interesting information. So the temperature of the wall at the time of the survey was 13 degrees centigrade, and that creates a graph, and you can see the surface relative humidity on this graph is hitting 100% for a majority of the time. That means that condensation is taking place. And I think I showed you earlier that actually, so this is property G, and that the dew point was low. Well, that's because vapor has been removed from the air, not because of any improved ventilation. So it's the actual condensation that's causing this depression in the dew point, not ventilation. And you can see that when there's heat, so if you look here, this is probably a period when there was a sun out on the 14th of January. There's a spike in the external temperature, which causes a spike in the dew point and a spike in the internal temperature. And that is, do you notice how the temperature is below, it's 8.9 degrees centigrade. So anyway, that heat is causing evaporation from the local area. So the wall that was damp because of condensation is now evaporating, causing a spike in the internal dew point. And these are different data loggers in the same room. And you'll notice that the dew point is lower. So this is called dew point differential. Dew point is lower in the next to the damp section of wall. So that means that there's more vapor elsewhere in the room than next to the damp section of the wall, which is what happens when there's condensation. But there's a sudden spike. So there's more vapor next to the damp wall when there's heat, and that's because there is evaporation taking place. Evaporation and condensation are opposites. So anyway, everyone can do this. There's a risk analysis button at the bottom which you can press, and this is generated by AI, but what I'm trying to do is create an AI system that will look at all the data and evaluate it rather than just look at individual calculations. So in conclusion, you'll see a lot of different issues from a lot of different properties. I think this month is quite a good example of the range that I get, not a single case of rising damp. Everything else can be explained by other forms of dampness. So what I said to my nephew when he had a survey and the surveyor said that they thought it might be rising damp, I said to my nephew to get a damp proofer quote, and to use that to discuss price with the owner, knowing that it wasn't rising damp was going to be your problem, but you would have a bit of money to deal with whatever was causing the dampness. Now, it could be that it was just condensation from lack of ventilation, lack of dehumidification, lack of heating, lack of air movement. Could be as simple as that, in which case you're lucky, but it could be more complicated, as you've seen in some of the properties here. So if it was a leak in the subfloor void, or there was a broken drain, that could cost a few thousand. So you need to look after yourself and cover yourself. So in summary, no big problems with these properties.